So first of all, I have a question for you here tonight. How many of you love horror movies? Raise your hand. Okay, I see one brave soul in the audience. How many of you like roller coasters? Raise your hand. Adrenaline junkies of some sort. I have to be honest and say those things, they were never quite my cup of tea. It's not, especially in the case of horror movies, it wasn't just the blood and the gore and the monsters that would keep me up at night. It was that I absolutely hated that gross feeling in my chest whenever my heart would start to beat. And it turns out that I've only experienced that sensation a couple of other times before. One of those times was whenever I was in about 5th or 6th grade, and I was visiting Grandfather Mountain, which is close to here, and there's this big suspended bridge. Well, it turns out I learned that day that I'm afraid of heights. What a convenient time to hear. And on top of this ravine, essentially perched on this bridge, I was trying to get from one edge to the other. It was a windy day, nonetheless. So you can imagine this bridge swinging back and forth. It earned its name of a swinging bridge. Fortunately, I got through it. The other time that my heart was beating outside of my chest like that actually was in essentially any math class I can think of from 1st grade to now. It wasn't just that I was unmotivated. I was a great student. In every other class, I made all A's. I always tried to participate. It wasn't even that I couldn't do math. I could, count the money in my piggy bank. I could mentally calculate the price of a tip at a restaurant. But there was something about being in a math class, sitting down, that made me feel like I had the stomach flu. My stomach would start to turn knots like any roller coaster that I was also afraid of. Turns out I have many fears, as many of us do. My palms would start to sweat, especially anytime I imagined the teacher was going to call on me. And in those moments, I didn't know it at the time, I was suffering from math anxiety. What is math anxiety in the first place? The theme of this whole entire day is simplicity, so maybe we're getting off on the wrong foot, because it turns out math anxiety is a lot more complicated than we could have guessed. Math anxiety is a negative emotional or mental response to math, aka a fight or flight response. There's a section in our brain called the amygdala that is the fear siren, the big red button, so to speak. And for me, that fear siren lit up, guess when? Math class. I would look at a Scantron sheet, I would look at that math problem, and suddenly, woo, 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 woo. I was surprised no one else in the class could hear it. It was so loud for me. I asked to use the bathroom sometimes just because the numbers would start to float before my eyes. It was like mathception. I was surprised that no one else, at least that I knew of, had this negative response to math. And it wasn't just me. Although it's hard to even acknowledge or diagnose math, because it turns out most horror movies don't feature finding the circumference of a circle. And most students with math anxiety don't go screaming in terror from their classrooms, or at least not that I've seen. Math anxiety, as it turns out, has multiple facets that really complicate the whole issue. Parents' expectations, the effectiveness of your teachers, social anxiety, learning disabilities, bullying, gender norms. Well, I don't know if we can ever really simplify something that has this many components in the first place. And so it's easy to see how math anxiety definitely may not be as simple as we first thought. It's not just that we dislike math. It's not even that we're just bad at math. It's that there are so many cultural roots that lead us to feel this way. Even now, as someone who wants to be a teacher, I sometimes open up and I say, look, just like I'm doing now, I have math anxiety. It's not just that I'm bad at math in kind of the cutesy way that we see on TV. It's that it genuinely makes me feel sick to my stomach. Well, a response I oftentimes hear is, you're an English major. English majors just aren't that good at math anyway. Or people will say, oh, you're a girl. Girls tend to not be that good at math in the first place. You're not the only one. But really, these problems feed into the bigger list of issues that prevent our students from having these skills that they need in the real world. So flashing back to my days whenever I didn't quite know what to call my upset stomach, trembling hands, heart beating outside of my chest, I did as many other people naturally do in math class. I disconnected. I started writing poetry. It was a great way for me to fulfill my anxiety, to distract myself from the math that freaked me out. And whenever I was doing it, I would feel accomplished. I would feel like as you do a word puzzle and you twist the words to fit the meaning, and finally you say, yes, I figured out this problem. That's what I felt like whenever I would write a poem. Sometimes it would take me several class periods to write one. But whenever I finally did, whenever I twisted those syllables into place to make those words work, it felt like I had done something great. So first it started off as a way to avoid math, but I never realized while I was writing poetry in my math classes, I couldn't have even written any poetry at all unless I had some basic level math skills. Because after all, poetry is largely math. And I don't think we can appreciate the vastness of pi without really having a poetic understanding of what infinity could mean. Poetry essentially is math. I don't see anyone fighting that, but I see in your mind you're feeling a bit hesitant, so I hope to win you over. In my math classes, my anxiety needed a bridge, like that bridge on Grandfather Mountain that got me from one rocky area to the other. That's what we need for our students who have math anxiety. Poetry can serve as a bridge between basic level math skills, something as simple as counting or identifying patterns, and it can build them up to having a mastery. Poetry introduces us to this idea of trial and error. It helps us become less intimidated as an equation would, that right or wrong nature that we often ascribe to math. Shakespeare, for example, uses iambic pentameter as a form of poetry. However, whenever we study iambic pentameter and its definition, it sounds pretty darn intimidating, at least to me as someone who may not immediately understand what these words mean. It operates on a 0-1 binary rhythm with 5 iambic feet. Now, how many of you, whenever you start to see that siren in your brain, that big red button, it's starting to, in the distance, wildly shriek, woo, 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 woo. A couple, I can tell from your facial expressions that maybe this is not what you're entirely familiar with. So let's put these words into context. After all, what are we scared of? We're scared of things that don't make sense to us, things we don't understand. So a way we can break down that math anxiety of seeing words like this is by putting it into a real world context. So go ahead, I want you all to help me out here. Raise your hand and you're gonna clap out a heartbeat with me, okay? Are we ready? Okay, oh, I love it. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Very good. So whenever we see 0-1 binary rhythm with 5 iambic feet, that's just a heartbeat. It's the pattern of a heartbeat. Many of us would feel much less intimidated if we learned of iambic pentameter in that context. If our teacher said, write me a poem in iambic pentameter, versus write me a poem that sounds like a heartbeat, that would probably have a different context. Let's do a little more practice here. Okay, I want us to all count it out again, all right? This time we're putting words to it, so we're kind of elevating it here. Are you still scared of counting syllables? Very good, y'all are pros. Let's do it one more time. Are you still scared of counting syllables? What you're doing, without even realizing it, is that you're doing some sort of math. You may not be counting, okay, I've gone through 4 syllables now, we're going into the 5th. But in doing a pattern, your mind is counting. Who would have thought that maybe we're making math a little more simple than we expected? William Shakespeare's sonnet 130 operates on this principle. So now is the real tried and true test. I want y'all to clap this one out with me as well. My mistress' eyes look nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. What's awesome with poetry is that it's individualized and it has less pressure. Math, we may think, just has one right or wrong response. How many of us in a math class, we've gone through, we know the exact steps of how to solve an equation. We may spend an entire page working on that. But the professor counts us wrong. We ask, why? I knew everything. But it turns out about 3/4 of the page down, we've accidentally had a positive sign instead of a negative. Or we've made an error. Unfortunately, for many of us with math anxiety, that prospect of getting something wrong, of not having that exact right answer, may prevent us from even trying, which happens for many of us with any sort of anxiety at all. But poetry operates on the principle of trial and error. I can't imagine hardly anyone who would write a poem just right off the bat, not having to think of which syllables to add, which words would work, and would think, this poem is a masterpiece, this poem is my best work. No, it takes revision, and students learn that over time. It also has an equation is a form. An equation would require students to plug in certain words, certain ideas to work it out. Is a poem any different? In that students, in order to write a stanza of a sonnet, they would need to have, the 10 syllables per line in order to meet 14 lines. So poetry is much more similar to math than we ever would have expected. And as well, on the basic level, learning patterns, especially if they're using iambic pentameter, that heartbeat sound. And even more than that, they're counting and practicing those basic level math skills. It's individualized in that while we're scared that in a math problem, our response, sorry, not the right answer at the bottom, your whole entire work is wrong, 2 different students could write 2 very different sonnets about 2 completely different things. But they both would be correct, so to speak. They both would meet that form. They all would have 10 syllables per line, 14 lines. But one sonnet is about love, the other hate. One about fear, the other joy. One about nature, the other a city life. And would those different results, those different ends, be wrong? Not at all. Because in poetry, even though you're practicing these math skills, that individualization is really, really heralded as the root of authenticity. The Golden Fib is an example of how poetry really serves not only based upon math, not only is it built from these math principles of counting, finding patterns, but understand certain mathematic ideas in the first place. The Fibonacci sequence, I have to be honest, I knew nothing about it, and it scared the living daylights out of me until I was writing this talk. And whenever I was trying to teach myself, what is the Fibonacci sequence, I asked several of my math major friends. They would tell me, and I would instantly hear that little siren in my brain, that amygdala, start to wail in the distance. Woo, 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 woo. Because do you know what the Fibonacci sequence looks like? This. And whenever you see it, this wave, you have a very difficult time of identifying what does that even mean. In short, I'll break it down for you all. At the center are small numbers, maybe 1. And then the numbers build up. 2, 3, 5, 8, bigger and bigger and bigger. So essentially shows us another pattern, as poetry often does. And it shows us how numbers build upon each other to create a wave. The Golden Fib helps us better understand that by putting it into practice. Here's a Golden Fib example that I wrote. It starts off, as you can see, small. You have 1 syllable, then another 1 syllable. Then it starts building up and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And after you've written this golden fib poem, imagine what it would look like if you folded it up, you crinkled it on a piece of paper, so to speak. It would look an awful lot like this, like a wave. And whenever you're reading this poem aloud, it sounds an awful lot like a wave because the numbers get bigger and bigger. So, for students who are having difficulty with the Fibonacci sequence, what better way to help them really understand, at least on an elementary level, what that means than by helping them write it out and make their own conclusions based on practice. In other words, why is it so important for all of us as teachers, people who want to be teachers, to do work like this? To work on poetry in our math classes, especially if we're ourselves not that great at poetry. What good is it? Other than just becoming great at it ourselves, it's because we have two rules as teachers, two duties. Those duties are to provide accurate information to our students and to provide applicable information. I think many teachers would agree with me, and this is how I was taught to teach my students and what I stand by. Whenever you applicably teach students, you help them realize what those lessons mean to them. Perhaps that's why I was always afraid of math, because I was never able to learn exactly what it meant for me and how I could and how I should and need to use it in my everyday life. And also, whenever we do things like this, find these bridges, these simple solutions to math anxiety, we not only better understand each other's fields and help bolster knowledge as a whole, reaching students who, without poetry, maybe they wouldn't be able to really find their niche in English. We also help shape citizens who are creative thinkers and who can really use their analytical skills to go on and recognize, one, social problems in our world, but with their practice of applying these real-world skills in a creative way unique to them, they can use that authenticity to change the world and finding solutions as informed citizens, questioning knowledge in order to make it better and to shape their own. So the next time you or someone you know is really thinking about teaching an English class or really any class at all in which a student may have math anxiety, I want you to remember one thing. Use poems as a simple bridge to math. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great day.